since the years of Mao, when intellectuals and professors were driven from the universities and beaten, tortured, and killed. Scholarly books were burned, and 4,000 years of culture destroyed. Scholars, intellectuals, those with the highest education, and even full professors received the lowest pay. Even a waitress at a foreign hotel earned many times that of a full professor. The Chinese had a saying, as poor as a professor, as dumb as a PhD. Over 400 million Chinese were illiterate. The people were kept ignorant and in darkness by a repressive dictatorship which was consumed with making money. Deng had proclaimed that to get rich was glorious, and those in power, including Deng's family, were getting very rich. Just as the leadership feared, students at dozens of universities saw Hu's death as an opportunity to protest crime and corruption among the top leaders. Students created a petition listing their demands. Then they marched to the leadership compound where China's top leaders live and work. The students held a sit-in, demanding that their petition be received by the leaders of the party, only to be refused. The students then marched and staged a sit-in in front of the Great Hall of the People, where Hu's memorial service was being held, demanding dialogue and again presenting their petition. Hu-Jintau's funeral was scheduled for April 22nd, and despite government warnings to disperse, over 50,000 people defied the government and assembled outside the Great Hall of the People for Hu-Jintau's funeral. Chinese police stood outside and guarded the building. The people of China were not welcome at the Great Hall of the People. The students responded by chanting and shouting, "Down with dictatorship," and "We love freedom." Just as the leadership feared, students at dozens of universities saw Hu's death as an opportunity to protest crime and corruption among the top leaders of China. The rulers of China were also in a quandary. Although Hu had been deposed for pushing democratic reforms, Hu was still a loyal communist fighter who had held many important posts. Hu deserved all the honors of a state funeral. But the dictators were wary. Li Peng advised, "The universities should be carefully watched," he said, "for students were the most well-informed and the most likely to voice complaints." Students demanded direct talks with Premier Li Peng and shouted, "Dialogue, dialogue," and come out, Li Peng." Li Peng, however, had no intention of coming out. He felt the demonstration should be nipped in the bud and put to an end by force, if necessary. Finally, 3 students were allowed to approach the Great Hall, where the leaders watched from behind huge windows and barred doors. The students carried a huge scroll, a replica of those scrolls which for thousands of years had been presented to the emperors of China. Bowing their heads and kneeling, the students thrust the petition into the air and waited. When government leaders gazed out the windows of the Great Hall of the People, they were amazed, shocked, and frightened. The assembly of so many people was a direct challenge to their rule. The petition contained 7 demands, including freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of thought, freedom and more money for education, and the end of corruption among Chinese government officials and their families. Many of the demonstrators began to cry when they observed their student leaders being ignored as they kneeled in front of the Great Hall with the petition held above their head. The communist government refused to acknowledge the presence of the people, and Premier Li Peng left the building by a side entrance. As one political scholar remarked, "The main problem with China today is the lack of democracy. A handful of people can talk among themselves and put aside the interests of the Chinese people and make decisions the people do not support." Some in the government, such as Zhao Ziyang, felt they should affirm the students' patriotism and allow for dialogue. Yet others, notably Premier Li Peng, President Yang, and Deng Xiaoping, were alarmed, fearing that demands for freedom and democracy would threaten their power, and worrying they were witnessing the beginning of a second cultural revolution. Corruption and profiteering were widespread in the communist government, and the children and families of Deng, Yang, and many others had enriched themselves through the control they exercised over state and military-owned business enterprises and monopolies. Deng and Yang were concerned because the demands for democracy threatened their power, and the complaints of corruption threatened the wealth they and their families had accumulated. China was a communist country in name only, and senior leader Deng had embraced the most predatory features of capitalism, which hated unions and worker rights and free education for the masses. Thus, under Deng, worker pensions, free medical care, and free education were all becoming relics of the past, with even farmers and peasants having to pay high fees to have their children educated. Deng had proclaimed that to get rich was glorious, but only those in power were getting rich. Over the following days, the student demonstrations only increased in size, and so did their demands for democracy, accountability, and freedom. This is no ordinary student movement, Deng complained. This is a well-planned plot whose real aim is to reject the Chinese Communist Party. We have got to be very clear in explaining to the nation why we must stop and oppose this turmoil. On April 26, 1989, Deng's opposition to the democracy movement was reprinted as an editorial in the People's Daily. It was titled, "The Necessity for a Clear Stand Against Turmoil." This is a well-planned plot. Its real aim is to reject the Chinese Communist Party. The purpose of the students is to poison people's minds. The whole nation must resolutely stop and oppose the students, proclaimed Deng's editorial. Even though the Chinese Constitution guarantees the right to free speech and to demonstrate, the People's Daily editorial was like an official charge of criminal activity. Mao used similar editorials to launch political persecutions against his enemies. Now Deng had followed the same road. Peaceful demonstrators were being labeled counter-revolutionaries and terrorists who could be arrested, beaten, and even killed by the authorities. Deng had declared war, and he expected the Chinese people to obey him, to fear him, and to attack the students. The students, however, were not counter-revolutionaries. They wanted reform, not revolution. They wanted to be allowed to exercise and experience basic human rights, including freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. And for this, they were accused of committing crimes. The editorial triggered an explosive reaction which left Deng, Yang, and Li Peng shocked.